Our next speaker I'd like to introduce is Andy Christensen. I've known Andy for a number of years, and he truly is one of the pioneers in using additive manufacturing for medical purposes. So I'm looking forward to hearing his speech as well. So welcome, Andy.
Good, thank you. Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I feel like I will definitely walk away knowing much more than I give, but hopefully to kind of take what we learned already this morning and put a different spin on it. So I think Brent did a great job of kind of elaborating on all the technologies, and I think for me, that makes it easier. I'm not going to talk about much of the detail of those technologies, but show some of the applications specifically for medical purposes. I come from a company in Colorado, medical modeling, doing additive manufacturing for medical. So this is really all we as a company are doing. So typical, I'll go back up and just show you a couple of things that are more interesting to look at for what we do, and then we'll kind of back into some of the details of how we get from one place to another and where the applications are today that are kind of driving some quantities in this area, and then where things go tomorrow in terms of additive manufacturing application to medical technology. And specifically, I think we've seen some applications actually talking about aligners for dental and orthodontics. I mean, there's some really cool applications in dental that are pushing forward all of this. And I'm mostly going to stay away from dental specifically because it's not we're more focused as a company on medical technology. So really surgical planning and people getting hips and knees and, parts of their jaws reconstructed after tumors and such. So these are typical applications of the past, big surgeries, surgeries where we're seeing much, large defects, and surgeons really need something physical. So a lot of the historical use of additive manufacturing in medicine has been creating these facsimile models of patient data. So taking a CT scan and creating a model to be used in surgery to physically allow the surgeon to plan surgery and do surgery on a model before they do surgery on a patient. I think we all would agree we'd rather the surgeon practice on the model before practicing on us, and especially in things that are very non-routine. And a lot of things in the head and neck are kind of non-routine. Everybody's a little different. They want to reconstruct the patient so they look right, are symmetrical. You get into the hip and the knee, things are very similar. We all have differences, but they want to achieve certain angles and geometries. So many times in the head and neck is where we've seen a lot of these done. And applications where, where you're making a model or making guides, so implant-supported guides are really key use. And this is kind of a pseudo-surgical dental technology. But moving through, all kinds of other things where, you're making models that come from some form of medical image data or pseudo-medical image data in the form of a 3D kind of facial scan technology, and outputting that in a way that will allow the surgeon to either plan the procedure better, execute it more efficiently time-wise, or create custom prosthetics that really there's no other way to do except to do in a fashion that would use additive manufacturing in some form of the technique, whether it be just for the planning model or whether it actually be for the prosthetic itself by some additive metal or other technique. Many different kinds of things. You've seen the technologies, so many of them are used. And historically, our industry in the medical side hasn't cared about the materials as much. So we just heard about really the extreme, more the extreme of materials in aerospace. And you think of medical typically is pretty heavily regulated by the FDA in the U.S. and by other agencies in different parts of the world. And there's a lot to be said about the materials in terms of their biocompatible use, but not as much on that widget and whether it's going to get beat up, by flying at such G-forces and whatever. And that's led us to use the full extent of a lot of the additive manufacturing technologies to do different things for color, for transparency, for whatever. And I think you'd see a lot of that. And you'd see some of them that would make the news. We, as a company, spent a lot of time working on conjoined twins just as a hobby, really. Never made any money, but just donating service to those cases you'd see on the news every couple of years that made a lot of splash. And these cases, they'd use these physical models to really take a very complex procedure and try to bring it down to a level that the whole surgical team, of what could be 20 or 30 or 50 people could understand to try to make these procedures not only time efficient in the best way they can, taking a procedure that might be 100 hours and trying to turn it into 50 hours, but as well, trying to save lives. Other things that are less, I throw this up as an interesting piece. There's an exhibit at the Smithsonian actually right now showing a lot of additive manufacturing technology and parts. So if you're in DC, the Natural History Museum is great. And there are many other applications that kind of are I'd say pseudo related to medical, using additive manufacturing for for models that aren't necessarily to be used clinically, but this is a model of a mummy that still, I believe, is on display here in the San Francisco area at a museum called the Rosicrucian Museum. So to show you some images just of some of what's going on, I wanted to back up and talk about what makes, what's it take to kind of get some of these things done, and the key guiding technologies that allow us to do what we do that are facilitating more and more surgery. This turns out to be where a lot is in how you interact with the data and what you do with it, and how you change that raw data into a plan that a surgeon can use to actually guide surgery. So not just pretty pictures, but really guiding pictures that end up guiding treatment. And then how do you get to that treatment? So we'll talk about really where additive manufacturing comes in is really what we call clinical transfer. So if you've got a surgical plan in the computer, how do you take that and apply it to the surgery, without just taking it in your head and saying, okay, I cut this bone and I moved it around a little bit, but actually having something physical to take that to surgery. Sorry. Metals and plastics, so we'll talk about both of those a little bit. I think for plastics, we're mostly talking about models and guides and templates and other things for surgery, instruments as well, and I'm not going to focus too much on that, but there's a lot of really standardized instruments that are being created and used in both additive metals and plastics. But metals will focus a little bit on direct production of implants, which is really a key area that will continue to grow in the medical field, in the manufacturing side, which is really converting what are typically all the old techniques, the same in aerospace, so casting, forging, machining are all used and are all very typical in the medical area. But more and more, there are things we can do additively that you just can't do, and so those things are clear indications for moving to additive metal. But there are also things that you can do better or faster or cheaper additively than you can with other techniques. Sorry, the last piece, you still need a skilled surgeon. So this is kind of common. I was at a meeting this last week, and we're talking about all these great these implements for taking surgery and making it more accurate and more time efficient. And, in the end, you still need the surgeon. It doesn't dumb it down to the level where you don't need the surgeon there, doing what he does or she does very well and being trained and having the clinical experience behind him. But you do make it so that you kind of level out the learning curve a little bit. So you take the less experienced surgeon and you allow them to move up maybe a little faster than they could otherwise, because they can kind of see things in a different light. So moving ahead, medical imaging, there's a lot of movement going on in medical imaging, and much of what you'd see just in regular hospital-based imaging, everything's moving to being higher quality, better resolution, faster, cheaper, probably not. I mean, cheaper in some ways, but medical imaging actually turns out to be fairly costly. So if you go in, if you've had to go in to get your knee scanned and had an MR, typically those procedures are still costing a couple $1,000s, for an MR scan, which is very costly. So there is a push to try to make that cheaper. And in CT the same way, there's been a push really to reduce radiation has been a big part of it. So making machines that are faster, that can acquire more images faster, both gets a patient in and out of the hospital faster, but as well a tool that they can use to try to reduce radiation by using more smarter techniques for acquiring the data. And I don't know if many of you would see, but in the mainstream media, there's been quite a bit in the last year on radiation dosage things. So things in the New York Times and a couple of high-profile articles about radiation, and a few things that have really kind of stunned that industry. And I think there's a lot going on right now there that will continue to push forward to get better quality data with less radiation. The other big push is in dental imaging. So these scanners, I don't know how many of you have been to the dentist lately, but more and more they'll start to implement these in-office scanners like this one that's basically an in-office CT scanner. So much like you'd go to the hospital traditionally for and lay down on a couch and get shoved in and out of a regular CT, you go to the dentist office, and in a 20-second acquisition, they're actually imaging your whole head and imaging all your teeth and imaging the bone and the soft tissue and all that. And it kind of takes the place of, even recently I had to go in and get, the series of little x-rays, that they've called bite wing x-rays historically, but 20 of those things that they're shoving in and out of your mouth. And it's painful, and it's time consuming, and it's just inefficient in general. So here are these machines that are relatively cheap, many of them going below 100K, but say 100 to 300K machines, what used to be $3 or $4 million machines that were only, based in a hospital setting. So this is pushing things a lot, and really imaging as well in the dental specialties. There's even, surface scanning wise, a whole lot going on for teeth. So if we again look at the aligner, kind of product where you're just moving around teeth and you need aligners to kind of fit and move teeth around, the ability to take a scan of the mouth digitally is a huge push, and their technology is already there now, kind of moving that way, and it's still kind of in its infancy, but it's a big business. Many billions of dollars been spent on the research surrounding that to try to get away from the fact where they have to take and put putty in your mouth, and I'm sure many of you had to do that, getting orthodontics or whatever. Historically, you're going to take impressions, which are again not so pleasant for the patient. So medical imaging is moving a lot, which is guiding the need to do, manipulation. So the next step for what we're doing, we'll talk about many different things kind of in a minute of different applications of this, but in the end, you've got to take data, for a CT that might look something like this, and you've got to extract only what you really need to see out of that, So here we're seeing all kinds of things from the spine and the ribs and all the internal organs and the soft tissue. And for this particular case, maybe you only need to see, the kidney, or maybe you only see this vessel, or this nerve as it enters the spine at this level. Or this part of the skull, relating to something else. So extracting out of this the useful information that will form the basis in 3D of what you need to simulate turns out to be a big, is a big step, is a very time-consuming step. So kind of the expert systems and the automation for doing this are not yet where they need to be to kind of make this as efficient as it needs to be. So it really is one of the most laborious, steps in the process. And really, what I mentioned earlier about the in-office imaging systems for dental, they've actually taken a step backwards a little bit. The image quality, while more resolute, is actually less accurate in ways that allow for automation of dealing with it. And so it ends up with more information and harder to deal with information that turns into more time. So there's been some forward steps and some backward steps there, but automation is definitely part of the future for where that's going, and keeping time to a minimum. Really, the key to a lot of these technologies is that they're too time intensive and thus too expensive. Surgical planning would be the next step, and we'll talk about a case or two to kind of show what this means in guidance. A lot of our work as a company is spent in orthopedics and in the head and neck, historically, where a lot of applications are very specific. But surgical planning, is done once you've got that data, the 3D simulation of that data that you've either gathered from a CT or an MR scan, you need to do something to it to kind of facilitate then the surgical procedures. And a lot of what's done now, there's a big push, and I'll show some of it, but a big push in knees, for standard total joint replacement in knees, which are done to the tune of, 1 million+ cases a year. There's a big push to try to make that more efficient, and more efficient by customizing the way that knee fits you or me by use of kind of simple guides and jigs. And we'll talk about that in a minute. On the right, there's actually a case I'll show in a second as well. But the next step, once you've planned out the surgery, and a lot of times we're involved in moving bone around. Bone's easier to simulate. There are a lot of reconstructive areas in the body that relate to moving bone around and fixing things from either trauma or congenital problems or joint replacement. And a lot of what we're focusing on today is joint replacement based, because it's where the market is. So things like knees. Once you've got a digital plan for creating cuts in a knee, for instance, you need to take that to the patient. So you'll use guides and jigs and different things to kind of guide that. And other times the guide and what the end product of the planning is really the reconstruction of a defect. So a patient that has a defect like this, or this is going to be surgically created, designing the implement that'll fit that perfectly. And then associated instrumentation for doing those things as well. And again, most of the tools today are plastic. Most of the implants are metallic. There are many plastic implantable materials that are used. Many of those not available yet in additive manufacturing basis, but many of them I think to come. So for plastics, we've seen many of the technologies earlier. So I'm glad I don't have to go through showing you that. But if you can think of any of those, many of those are perfect for these complicated shapes that are custom for every person. So while each of us may only be a little bit different from each other, we're all completely different. And the way that instrument or guide is going to fit you and me is different. So this is a perfect fit for additive manufacturing, where you can have 20 objects in a build, and the 20 objects can be slightly different, and the machine doesn't care at all. And the complexity part of it, again, you kind of get the complexity for free, so there's the ability there to not really worry about it. Again, a lot size of 1 works well, and that 1 can be produced in a series of 500 at a time, if it fits. That 1 can also be produced by itself when time is an issue. And then, materials, there's a lot of materials, and many of those that are made using the techniques we saw earlier have been tested. So this chart isn't all-encompassing, but many things to look at for kind of applications of the main technologies, and some of these terms aren't the standardized terms that Brent was talking about, but historically stereolithography and laser sintering and fused deposition modeling and 3D printing, and some of the newer techniques like polyjet, which is one of the first to kind of go multi-material. You'd look for all kinds of different factors. So you'd have materials that are better for certain things, and they're flexible. So you need something that's you can simulate flexibility. So you pick a material there. You also look for biocompatibility. So many of the applications are needing kind of limited biocompatibility. So these are parts that are going to go in, be used in surgery, maybe just for your surgery, and after that they're going to be thrown in the trash. So they just need the ability to be sterilized and used in that case for limited contact with your body tissues, and then they're going to be tossed. So depending on the materials, there's some, many of the processes have materials that have been tested to certain standards. There are kind of set, ISO and ASTM standards for materials, but you look at that in the same way in metals. So if you look at metals, two main technologies are kind of driving the use of metals, specifically for implants. So again, I'm not talking about instruments, but talking about implants that are directly fabricated with additive manufacturing. And most all of it is driven by this desire to get to something that bone likes. So many orthopedic implants, are made. I'll show some photos in a minute, but you've got an implant that's going to go into your hip, and really there are a couple of keys. It's got to be strong enough to kind of withstand the forces. It's got to have an articulating surface to function against something else. But where it interacts with your bone, that bone, you need that to be a really strong fit. And if that fit isn't strong, and the potential for the immediate fixation there isn't good, that implant will loosen and fail. And loosening of those implants is the #1 cause of failure of those implants. So the tighter and the more connected kind of mechanically you can fit that implant, the better. Many times today, the way that's done is you have a solid component, and you'll adhere a porous component, or you'll spray on a porous surface to the back of that component to get good bone ingrowth. In additive manufacturing, you can create it all at once. So you can make a solid component where you need solid, and you can make porous component where you need porous, and you can actually do things that are, again, not possible with traditional techniques. And the products on the market. This is an example of some of the the spongy bone inside, the trabecular bone inside the body. One of the leading products on the market that's not made with additive technology, kind of produces shapes that look like this, and many companies on the market want something that's very uniquely porous. And the body, especially in titanium, the body loves titanium. So the bone and titanium really like each other. And titanium bone will go right up against titanium and form this bond that's great. So if you can get something that's very porous and kind of tortuously porous, bone will mechanically lock to it, which is good. So kind of getting back to, how is additive manufacturing changing surgery? We'll look a little bit at, some of what's going on. So as I mentioned, joint replacement, there were about 3 million joint replacements done in 2010, and that's a worldwide number. But 3 million cases is a lot, and the industry here is, I think around $50 billion for the just the hardware part of it. So that's just implants and those types of things. Hips and knees are the primary areas, shoulders and ankles and other things, kind of coming. The U.S. market, though, is an interesting part. Historically, the U.S. market has been about half the global market. And that's growing, especially in things like knees, which are projected to grow a lot over the next 5 and 10 and 20 years. And there's a lot of it today, so we'll talk about the technology for guidance in knees. And this number, turns out, my guess is that we're probably in the range of some tens of thousands. 40,000 is a pretty good guess for how many knees are done today that are additively manufacturing guided procedures, and maybe we're at something like 3% of that, which is actually pretty good, considering that it's only been a few years. Traditionally, in total joints, one size fits all has been mostly, has pretty much been the standard. So maybe there's a small, medium, and large, or there's a small, medium, and large for the right, and a small, medium, and large for the left. But they're going to make those implants fit you by carving you. They're going to take you and they're going to make you fit the implant as opposed to the other way around. So we're really kind of taking that and turning it in a different way, to say that we know what's on the shelf, you know, and this is, we'll talk about this in a second, but we know what's on the shelf. We know we've got size 1 through 8, you know, but how do we know exactly which one of those will fit you and exactly which way it'll fit you best to get the most longevity out of that implant? So for the traditional thinking, you know, it's very dependent on you being normal, you know, which we're all normal in some way, you know, so we're all within the normative curve, but it's very dependent on the skill level of the surgeon, and the time that it takes to make the decisions about how to fit that implant to you are taken during surgery. So you're in surgery and you're under the knife, and it's going to take another 15 minutes or 3 hours, depending on what you're doing, for the surgeon to figure out exactly how to do that the best for you. So if we can take that time and then push it to happening before surgery, that's I think we as the patient would all see that's great. You know, the surgeon as well would find some unique reason to find that you know, what's in it for them is to do better. So that surgery really needs to be personalized, and that's a lot of what's going on in medicine with the use of additive manufacturing relating to personalization. We'll talk a little bit about custom implants versus custom kind of guides to fit implants. The concept is, for a custom implant, you go through a series of steps that ends up giving you, and most times, a metallic implant. So that takes a while, and it's very, it's time and labor intensive. And in the end, that implant that's custom may cost 5 or 10 times more than the standard implant's equivalent. So what was $2,000 maybe turns into $10,000 or $20,000, which in the scheme of things it turns out to be a lot. The alternative is to take the standard implants that are off the shelf and plan out beforehand how to fit that standard implant to you using medical image data for you, and in the end make guides to guide insertion of that implant. And those guides can be made within a number of days and shipped at some fraction of a cost, hundreds of dollars instead of thousands of dollars. So taking, what is fairly standard procedures for doing a knee replacement, which involve, taking and cutting pieces of bone to fit these implants, and working backwards from the implant to create the osteotomies, or the bone cuts that are needed, and using plastic guides and sometimes metal inserted plastic guides, guiding those perfectly positioned, pre-planned movements during surgery. This can not only save time, but more so than saving time, make something like a knee last longer, which really is the big cost. In the head and neck, the typical patient, this is actually a guy that has obstructive sleep apnea. So this is somebody that has a real challenge with sleeping, has episodes of not getting sleep, but severe oxygen deficiency some of these patients have that are really life-threatening over time, and they may get to the point where it really could cause some major issues. So in this case, in the computer, we're planning out moving things around to a new position and guiding those things with templates. Now, I purposefully did not include a lot of bloody images today, so that you're thankful, because there are in the field there are a lot of things that are a little hard to look at. But in the end, we're guiding these big movements of bone around using templates and models and plates and jigs and different ways of kind of fitting things together. And these are typical, and these are these are things that are still in the hundreds and low thousands of cases. But we can take somebody like this and predictably help the surgeon to get this kind of a result, which not only there's a cosmetic element, but there's as well a major functional element. And the other, an interesting piece of all of this, if we looked at the knee or things in the head and neck, is related to assessing surgical outcomes, which historically are very hard to do. On a given patient population, if you put people into a group and you said, look, we've got 18 people with the same problem, you can say, by and large, surgery took an hour, and we did this and this and this. But for you specifically, if there's no plan, there's no way to assess how the surgeon did to the plan. Here, we now have a baseline for 3D comparison to assess how they did. So if they have a very specific plan that's accurate to what they're going to do in surgery, we can now compare how they did against what they did, which is pretty powerful. And things like, like overlays. So here, in blue, maybe is what we planned, and in green is actually what they got by imaging the patient afterward. And you say, why didn't blue and green, even up? And other ways of looking at points and looking at planes and doing things that really are fairly interesting from the surgeons to watch, because they've never been able to actually know how close they were getting to a plan, because they truly didn't have a plan. And their plan was to just look at a few images and walk into surgery. So we'll talk a little bit about metals. These are parts, some of these in the market in the U.S. for additively created metallic implants that are long-term implants. This is a European part, as mentioned earlier. This is a part that, you know, has gone into maybe 15 or 20,000 patients, and something like 30 to 40,000 parts have been created over time. So there's a lot of work in metals, and you know, the ability to do that on off-the-shelf components is one thing, but the ability as well to do that on a custom basis is a super, you know, is just a great fit for additive manufacturing. We can take a patient with a failed hip prosthesis, design exactly what the surgery needs to be to replace that prosthesis with something that fits better. You can tell the surgeon exactly where to take off bone, and then guide the whole thing through the instrumentation and the screws and the rest of it, all in one place. So, in a minute or so, where does this go in the future? There's a lot, you know, there's a lot in medicine. You'll hear robotics thrown out quite a bit. You know, I think most of us hear about robotics and think, God, I don't want to go in and have have surgery, have some big, you know, a hip or a knee or something fairly common, and have a robot doing the surgery, because I'm just a little worried about, you know, what if that robot doesn't screw up much, but they happen to screw up on me. So there's a lot of the interim step between now and full automation of surgery is actually kind of robotic assistance. So two main technologies, one related to, you know, an actual robot. So this is called the Da Vinci system. So this is fairly widely publicized, but surgeon sitting in the corner, you know, basically guiding small hands that can go in and do things in very tight spaces in the patient. So this robot sitting over here, actually working in the patient with different tools, surgeon sitting in the corner drinking a cup of coffee and guiding this thing like a video game. The other is for kind of robotic assistance as well, is for creating very freeform and custom bone cuts using a haptic-enabled device to actually show them where to go in surgery with a guide, you know, guiding the bone cuts in the bottom, helping the surgeon perform the surgery with some kind of built-in stop. So if he pushes too far, the machine's pushing back. And then I think where it goes from there, design matching functions. I talk a little bit about this in the paper, so I won't go through it here, but really to take what today is over-engineered and really define it, make it more personally engineered to that patient for structural purposes. And the same thing here for, you know, for functional elements, to really make those fit to you. This is an example actually from a company in the UK called Within. You know, it's a very interesting company, but taking, you know, finite element information and putting that into the design and making it way complex, and based on that, being able to push forward and do some things that haven't been done. And the same for materials. This is actually a PEC part. And PEEK and PEC are really moving into, you know, high fashion within the medical area, and PEC, specifically additively manufactured, should be where things go. So my final thoughts, today we're already seeing many thousands of patients benefiting in medical and dental the same way, and the trend toward more personalization is a good fit with where things are. And I think that, you know, in the future, the trick is making it more cost effective, and that still is where a lot of these technologies falter, is that they cost $1,000 or $2,000 a case, and it's too much. So thanks for your time. Happy to entertain maybe a question now.
All right, questions?
Jim Weiland, University of Southern California. Are you seeing better patient outcomes, you know, not you personally, but the field, with the AM parts versus the standard parts?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, typically the standard parts, for some of these things, the standard parts don't exist, right? So guidance doesn't exist. But in terms of the traditional way of doing surgery versus the guided way of doing surgery, yeah, we're finding surgeons talk about patients that are leaving the hospital sooner. You know, they're able to do procedures faster. So historically, you know, we'd see people say on average, just using a model. So if we go back to the earliest beginnings of just taking a CT scan and printing a bone model, by seeing that model and kind of moving bone around and seeing what they're going to do in surgery, the surgeon would say on average they could save 20% of the operating time for a given case. So 20% of time, you know, at anywhere from $100 to $300 a minute for operating room time turns out to be major, you know, savings. And we'll have surgeons tell us on fairly routine procedures they can save an hour to 2 hours, which turns out to be just a major, not only cost savings, but the less time you're under anesthesia, the better for outcomes. So the quicker you can go home, the less likely you are to have other issues that kind of come along with being out and sitting in a hospital.
Any questions?
Yeah, hi. My name is Eric Luthard. I'm actually a neurosurgeon at Washington University. One thing, you know, that I've found with kind of these models is that, you know, Certainly, I think for kind of, custom-made implants, such as kind of a bone defect, they're very good. But one thing is that in terms of planning, is that your head or your spine, for instance, is more than your bony anatomy. And I think one of the challenges, for kind of, pre-surgical planning with models is not just the hard tissue, the bones, but also knowing, for instance, because everybody's brain anatomy is quite different, and the soft tissue, and obviously with the tumor that's involving complex vasculature, it would be great to have the ability to have almost a tissue consistency matched model of that as well. Because that, can allows you to help plan for, if this tumor is involving, a major vessel or a major nerve or a major part of the brain, how do I deal with that beyond just kind of, say, reconstructing a jawbone or just reconstructing a bony defect?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good observation. Yeah, and I know in neurosurgery there are challenges. Some of the traditional ways of guiding surgery, you can use physical templates to guide surgery, but you can well use surgical navigation, so
right. And that's limited, because the brain shifts and moves around with, surgical navigation. That's why it's always planning prior to has always been a challenge, either with models or with the computer rendered versions, because you just can't get a sense of it.
Yeah, they both suffer from the same technological issue that you have to mimic those things very well, either digitally or physically.
Right.
And it's a challenge. There is a bit of a push. I mean, I think getting into neurosurgery maybe even further down the road, but for major joint replacement, there's a push toward trying to get away from cadaver work. So learning by cadavers and creating not only digital cadavers, which is useful, and there are ways to use that, but physical kind of cadaver replacements of models that mimic the tissues and increasing complexity for different types of tissues and different types of situations where you can do that. And I think there's a bit of a push there because the cadaveric work is so expensive that that we'll see more for materials hopefully going forward, and some of those that'll be directly output by additive manufacturing, although the flexible kind of materials are still somewhat limited today.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the thing, is if you could use additive manufacturing to create almost kind of gelatin-like consistencies of tissues, that would be extraordinarily helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Chris Luce, Semperis Biosciences. For the companies doing this work or the FDA, how do they plan to regulate the design window that's used to make sure, as people are doing custom designs, they're not getting close to the risk of mechanical failure or, for instance, particulate wear that could form during usage of orthopedics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, historically in the U.S., you go back, 10, 15 years ago, custom-made devices kind of fit an exemption of the FDA, so that you could sell, if you had a standard product, you could sell a custom product, just say it's custom and follow whatever your internal procedures are. But in the last 10 or 15 years, many of those products that are kind of common products, so say a hip or a knee or something like that, or cranial plate, have all moved into being approved by the FDA as custom, kind of patient-specific products with certain design windows. So for some of those, it's easier. So I was just looking. Think of a cranial plate. There'd be a certain minimum thickness. There'd be a certain, way it kind of interacts with the edge of the bone. But a lot of the rest of it would be, have a fairly large window. So I think you're right. When you start getting into things like knees, functional joints, I think is where you'd see that more and more, useful. And how I've seen the FDA relate to that sometimes is that they'll want to see a standard component that you're kind of basing your work against. So the interface, say between the knee, the femur and the tibia, they'd want to make sure that you aren't changing some geometry there that's not proven already, and that really what you're doing is just customizing the fit of the bone interface and not customizing actually the way the interface happens from a wear standpoint. So I think they lock that down is the general answer. The interface for an articulating surface, they really try to lock down both materials as well as surface.
Great talk, by the way. I have a more basic question. Has the industry looked at prosthetics? I mean, coming from a third world country, landmines have created more problems for lost limbs and lost body parts. And I was just curious if the industry as a whole has looked at additive manufacturing for prosthetic limbs or hands and things like that.
Yeah. The answer is yes. There's a bit of that being done now. It's been a bit of a step. I don't know of too many that are directly fabricated. So there has been some work in the past to actually make strong enough components that you could use as the socket itself, say for a lower limb prosthetic. But many of them today are using techniques that are kind of hybrid. So they're scanning, taking a residual limb, either scanning it digitally or taking a cast of it and scanning that digitally, designing the prosthetic kind of interface. Maybe looking at taking it as far as looking at the bone structure underneath, so maybe scanning the patient as well, looking at the loads and how to design that socket so that it, when it feels good and it's functionally in the right place. But using additive manufacturing itself to manufacture it hasn't yet kind of reached hasn't done a lot. It's the same in prosthetics for like ears and noses and eyes, which are done quite a bit. They're quite there's an industry surrounding for, many of them congenital deformities, but, missing ears. And there's still, even though we can get to some materials that are fairly pliable, they go through, it's pretty rigorous, so the materials need to be very, very strong. In the same way for prosthetic limbs, there's a lot of wear and tear, and directly manufacturable parts just aren't commonly used yet.
One more question.
I'm Nigel Correal with Motorola Solutions. And my question is if you can comment on the state of the art of using these type of techniques, for example, for tissue and organ growth and things like that. Where do you see the feasibility of that?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there, and groups focusing a lot on that. And I think others in the room actually may know a little bit more about that than I do. But a lot of what you'd see for kind of tissue regeneration. So in the future, one of the slides I at the end skipped over kind of briefly, but where things go today, the materials are either plastics or metals, and they're either put in and they stay in the same way forever, or in some of the cases for the plastics, and in neurosurgery used quite a bit, plastics that are resorbing, plastics that'll stay there a while, give some strength, and go away. Neither one of those really solve the issue of replacing a piece of anatomy, whether it be hard tissue like bone or soft tissue like some part of an organ, with a like tissue. So there's a lot of work on using things that'll turn into that specific tissue in the future, and many of those are using additive techniques at least to make the scaffold to then impregnate with some of the material that will either attract or promote growth of those different types of cells. I think in the future, much of what you'd see if you Google organ growing or something like that, you'd find videos. I mean, there are a few well-known groups out there doing this work, and you'd see, the conceptual way to make a kidney, for instance, you've got all kinds of different tissues working together in very complicated ways. So it makes sense to most that additive manufacturing is the way to create those, because in one given cross-section you can have 30 different things going on, and you can build that three-dimensionally, which just doesn't exist in many other techniques. So there is a lot going on there. There aren't therapies or many therapies on the market. There is some work, I think, for a skin graft actually at some point. I think there's very few commercial applications yet, but much research going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy.